What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we have the wide receiver, starts and sits, and we're going to go matchup by matchup, letting you know which players are expected to have good performances and which players you should probably try to find another option for. If two players are close, though, you probably should be looking at the rankings. They're on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Any news blurb, any important information that gets released, you know that impacts the rankings. But there's no bye weeks. We have a lot of matchups to get into, so I'm going to jump right into it. The first matchup is Indianapolis versus Tennessee. The highest ranked Tennessee receiver is 51st, Corey Davis. He put up a complete dud last week. I'm talking zeros across the board, but I'd be a liar if I'd say that's too surprising. He's been pretty disappointing. But when Mariota throws for 250, 3 touchdowns, and you put up a dud, yeah, you're not getting ranked top 50 against an underrated secondary like the Indianapolis Colts have. And I also think the Tennessee Titans secondary is also a bit underrated as well. But T.Y. Hilton, he did show enough to be ranked inside our top 20. You can start him as a wide receiver too. We do know his production is going to be a bit volatile. Typically, he's not a touchdown guy. Most of his touchdowns, they come on big plays. Seeing him score a 4-yard touchdown, that could be good news for him throughout the rest of the season. So T.Y. is seeming like he's a bargain based on where he went in drafts. But as for the other receivers in this game, A.J. Brown did go for 100 yards, so I know it could be tempting to start him. But don't forget, this is an offense led by Marcus Mariota. And they're also against an Indianapolis Colts offense that is simply not as powerful as it was under Andrew Luck. Should be a slower paced game that involves a lot of Derrick Henry and a little bit less of Marcus Mariota's arm. Up next, though, we have the Chargers versus the Lions. The big news this week, we know with the Chargers, is that Hunter Henry is out. And we know also Melvin Gordon is out. Both of those players served as the main red zone weapons for the Chargers. And who will benefit most from this situation? It's going to be Mike Williams. He already has a year of rapport in the red zone with a double-digit touchdown season under his belt. So it's very likely he could have a repeat performance of double-digit touchdowns. We have him ranked as wide receiver 34. Unfortunately, he is banged up right now though, so you would have to start him at your own risk. But let's talk Keenan Allen. We currently have him ranked at wide receiver 9, and Larry Fitzgerald, playing in a very similar role last week, had a complete field day. Keenan Allen should be in line for a great performance. On the Detroit side of things, you got Marvin Jones, Kenny Golladay, and I'm excluding Hawkinson because this is a wide receiver video, but I am going to bring up Amendola. Guys, don't get too caught up on Amendola's stats. If his actual snap share does increase, I will be interested. He does have a very similar skill set to Golden Tate, and when put in the position, he performed. You gain the trust of your quarterback, you gain the trust of your coaching staff. Good things happen. Worth a speculative ad, I guess, but playing on so few snaps, it would be silly to put him in your lineup. Marvin Jones, he doesn't have a great matchup either. Not too excited about Kenny Golladay. 9 targets is not bad, but remember, this game went into overtime. It went the full length of overtime, so you would think the clear wide receiver 1, the top option in a game like this, a little bit disappointing, but at least he didn't bust. So Jones, he's in that wide receiver 4 territory. As for Golladay, he is a high-end 3, low-end 2. Moving on though, Buffalo Bills versus the New York Giants. John Brown seems to have emerged as the top option on this passing offense. Josh Allen looks a bit more capable than he did last season, at least in the passing game. And to be frank, we've always been fans of John Brown. But if you were to tell me that his breakout would have actually came on the Buffalo Bills, I would have not believed you, because his breakout's been predicted many times now. But boy, did he look good. And the targets, they kept coming his way, so it shows a lot of promise, and the rankings definitely reflect that. He's wide receiver 23, head of names like Tyler Boyd, Calvin Ridley, Alshon Jeffrey. That just goes to show you how high we are on John Brown. But don't forget, it's against the New York Giants. Amari Cooper had a complete field day against them. Michael Gallup even went 7 for 7 for 158 yards. So that ranking for John Brown may seem a little egregious, but double-digit targets, 17.6 yards per reception, 123 yards and a touchdown. There's a good possibility he has a similar stat line this week. Sterling Shepard's been ruled out. That basically only leaves Evan Engram. Golden Tate still suspended. Benny Fowler, Cody Latimer, TJ Jones. Probably not going to be very high scoring, but a game I'm really excited for the Arizona Cardinals versus the Baltimore Ravens. 46-point over-under. Both of the offenses did look pretty competent. Larry Fitzgerald, I mentioned him earlier. Christian Kirk, he got a ton of targets. Do not worry about Christian Kirk. I know some of you may not have been super thrilled with his performance. 4 for 32, 1 rush, 12 more yards. It's not even a good performance in PPR. Don't get me wrong. I understand that, but you still have to appreciate the fact that he got 12 targets. Yes, Kyler Murray threw the ball about 150 times, but that was exactly what we expected. It's not like the volume is going to go down. We knew heading into this season that this team was going to have a lot of passing volume, a lot of rushing volume, which inevitably ends up to fantasy production. So while variance didn't quite work on his side this week, but when there's volume, there's fantasy points. Unfortunately, it is not a good matchup for either player. That was more of a season-long outlook. I think Baltimore is going to completely destroy them. Both players, Kirk and Fitz, they're both back-end wide receiver 3s. Still ranked ahead of Baltimore Ravens wide receiver Marquise Brown, who had a fantastic debut in the NFL after missing a lot of time due to injury. So it was definitely unexpected, but we got a little taste of exactly what this offense can do. I know we're all hoping for a repeat performance from Marquise Brown. I would love to see it personally, but we can't really expect Lamar Jackson to keep up that touchdown pace. First of all, they're facing Miami. Pretty sure that's going to happen to Miami all season long. Second, big plays are always very volatile. So we have him ranked in the 50s, so you don't want to start him, but he still is the highest ranked Baltimore wide receiver, so you know 100% you are not starting any other receiver on this team. Patriots versus the Miami Dolphins. We saw what Baltimore did to Miami. These receivers, they're going to have a good game. Which receiver is going to disappoint? Probably one of them. My guess, Edelman. I know he's been the main target in this passing offense for many years now, but he's also a guy who relies on a heavy target market share in order to produce. So if the targets go away, his PPR production reduces just enough for him to slip out of that high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1 in a PPR league to somewhat of a low ceiling back-end wide receiver 2. You don't sign Antonio Brown not to use him, who, by the way, was not placed on the commissioner's exempt list. It's a good sign for him playing on Sunday. It's the Patriots, though. We never know what they're going to do. No real need to go over Miami. There's Devontae Parker, who looked decent, but we have him ranked outside the top 50, and even the most desperate teams are not going to be forced to start him this week. So we'll move right into the next matchup. It's an NFC East divisional game. We have the Dallas Cowboys versus the Washington Redskins. Probably not going to be the most exciting game. I think both Keenum and Dak overperformed last week, so expect them to come a little bit back to earth, and that will trickle down to the receivers. Amari Cooper, he's obviously good. Michael Gallup, wouldn't expect him to have another 100-yard performance. Can you start him? Yeah. We currently have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 3. For Washington, Case Keenum has looked good at times, but he's also looked extremely bad, and Dallas's defense is very underrated. So you really shouldn't start any Washington receiver, at least not at this point and in this matchup. In an exciting matchup, we have Jacksonville versus the Texans. They are going to be without Nick Foles. The backup looked competent, but still, you really can't trust Dede Westbrook as much as you could with Nick Foles. We knew that Nick Foles was going to target him. He only had 5 targets. He did score a touchdown, but if you're only getting 5 targets, there is going to be a wide range of outcomes for what his performance will look like. And more than likely, it's going to come down to if they score a touchdown or not. It is worth noting that Marquise Lee is unlikely to play. DJ Chark, 146 yards, a touchdown. That's going to get anyone's attention. But again, 4 targets, tough to trust. More DraftKings play than anything. I think most of these receivers are, even the quarterback for that matter. I'm not too afraid of starting any of the receivers on Houston because Sammy Watkins tore them apart. They did not look good. They didn't look very good last season either. And Jalen Ramsey just is not as scary as he used to be. So you can start them. Should be no surprise we have DeAndre Hopkins ranked as wide receiver 2 this week. Will Fuller just squeaks in as a wide receiver 3, coming in at wide receiver 36. Up next, we have Seattle versus Pittsburgh. This is going to be one of the more interesting matchups for me to watch this weekend. Pittsburgh's favored by about 3.5 points. They're not expecting it to be a complete shootout, but it is one of the higher projected point totals of the week, which is pretty interesting because Seattle does like to slow the game down. Presumably, that could help out a player like James Conner, who underperformed last week. But we're here to talk wide receivers. Juju, he was practicing, likely going to play. If he plays, should have no problem performing. Tyler Lockett, also in the same situation. Expect a bounce back game from him as well. Juju, he's coming in at wide receiver 6. Lockett, wide receiver 21. So if you're playing these guys, they're going to be core members of your lineup. James Washington, DK Metcalf, Dante Moncrief. Unfortunately, not enough upside for you to put them in your lineup, but it's very likely this could be the game that one of those players really separates themselves from the field. So needless to say, I'm excited to watch this game. Another interesting matchup that I think a lot of people aren't paying enough attention to is Cincinnati versus San Francisco. These are two teams we have a lot of stuff we can learn from. They're both offenses going through a transition. Bengals a bit smaller than San Francisco, of course, but Mixon might not play. They have no AJ Green. Tyler Boyd's really just establishing himself in the offense. We have John Ross, who's really emerging, and also Tyler Eifert, who's actually healthy. So there's a new look to the offense, and they just threw the 5th most passing yards in team history this past weekend. Will it happen again? Likely not. But John Rossi's going to be on the cusp of someone who's startable. You know, he's going to be hit or miss. He did have a lot of targets, but like I said, the Bengals threw for the 5th most yards in franchise history. So you have to look at this as more of an outlier rather than what's going to be the norm. AJ Green, he got his walking boot off. Still no timetable for return. And Tyler Boyd, we have him ranked as wide receiver 24. So you can definitely play him with confidence. For San Francisco, though, it's really a mess at the receiver position. George Kittle, he's obviously the guy that you can trust in this offense. Dante Pettis, severely underperformed. Deebo Samuel, definitely a guy to keep your eye on. Marquise Goodwin. It's just really difficult to pinpoint exactly how this offense is going to pan out in about 4 to 5 weeks. Taking a shot on any of these players is probably a good idea, so make sure you continue to monitor that situation. The final 1 o'clock game is the Minnesota Vikings versus the Green Bay Packers. And right off the bat, we knew Minnesota was going to be passing the ball less. We weren't going to see these huge receiver games as often as we were going to see them last year. Adam Thielen having 100 yards and or a touchdown game over game is just not a realistic outcome for this season. They want to run the ball more, and we saw that. With that being said, there are better days for Stephon Diggs. Adam Thielen, he caught a touchdown, so he was fine. You weren't happy with the yardage, but this is still a consolidated market share, and both of these players need to be started every week. Kirk Cousins is good for fantasy. Kyle Rudolph had 0 receptions. We know where the ball is going. It's going to Diggs, it's going to Cook, and it's going to Adam Thielen. Both of these players ranked back-to-back at 15 and 16. And for the Packers, expect a bounce-back game from Devontae Adams. I know Minnesota is not an easy defense to play against, especially at the receiver position. The most consistent wide receiver last season did not skip a beat when he faced them in 2018, so I would definitely suspect a good game is coming, especially after one of his worst performances since 2017. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, he's not ready to start yet. Leave him on the bench, and the same thing goes for Geronimo Allison. If we had to start one, we're still going with Valdez. Moving on, though, we have the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Oakland Raiders, and Tyrell Williams really played well, and he could be a borderline wide receiver 1, top-end wide receiver 2 for the remainder of the season. We've seen him do it before with Phillip Rivers, and while Derek Carr is definitely a downgrade from Phillip Rivers, Derek Carr's already used to a similar type of receiver in Amari Cooper. You got to put him in the lineup, especially against Kansas City. Kansas City, we know they're going to put up a ton of points. This game has the highest over-under of the entire weekend, 53.5 points. And what does that mean? Not only are you starting Tyrell, you're going to start Waller, Watkins, Hardman even is a potential start. We have Hardman ranked as wide receiver 44. I know it's not astronomically high, but that is ahead of players like DK Metcalf, Robbie Anderson, Marquez Valdes-Scantling. So that just goes to show you. There is some upside in that play, but it's more of a glory play than anything. It is interesting, though, because he was drafted to fill that Tyreek Hill role. At the time that they drafted him, they were not sure if he was going to be playing on the team. You could definitely do worse. Sammy Watkins has to be started. If you own Sammy Watkins, you got to put him in your lineup. He has the potential to be a wide receiver 1 while he's healthy until Tyreek Hill returns. And if he plays well enough, his role could expand even while Tyreek Hill is on the field simultaneously with him. Last season, we did not see the connection there. In training camp, it was highlight after highlight with Watkins and Mahomes. We did not get that type of production last season, but Sammy Watkins also dealt with a lot of injuries, so knock on wood. Moving on to one of the most exciting matchups of the entire weekend, New Orleans Saints versus the LA Rams. We already know what we're going to get. It's going to be fireworks. I have no idea why this game has a lower over-under than the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Raiders, especially with Tyreek Hill out. And obviously they're projecting the Kansas City Chiefs to put up most of the points considering they're 7.5-point favorites. But if I were to put money on it, I would definitely put money on this game being the highest combined total of the entire weekend. You're starting Kupp, you're starting Woods, you're starting Cooks. Brandon Cooks, you definitely disappointed owners last weekend, but that's okay. Don't lose faith. He's been one of the more consistent wide receivers in the entire league for several years. Expect a bounce back game from him. We have him ranked as wide receiver 11, which is actually ahead of Robert Woods. But one thing you guys probably aren't remembering, this is a revenge game. Revenge games, don't ask me why. More often than not, they actually come to fruition. Deshaun Jackson against Washington. It was pretty easy to see that coming. Brandon Cooks, I would not be surprised at all. Expect a bounce back from him. Kupp is still ranked inside the top 20, but he is several spots below both Brandon Cooks and Robert Woods. So while Woods and Cooks, they're more of top-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1. Kupp, we still have him in the back-end wide receiver 2 range. Obviously, that's an auto start. The amount of points that are going to be scored in this game, I wouldn't be surprised if all of these receivers finish inside the top 12. And a similar situation actually goes for the Saints. Ted Ginn, Traquan Smith. You could start one of these players. It's going to be a low success rate, but these are some guys that can be on your radar. Chicago Bears versus the Denver Broncos, and I'll just come out and say I was pretty disappointed with the debut of Mitchell Trubisky. He's been so hit or miss, and he's not really developing into a player I can confidently say is taking that next step, but still better than Jay Cutler, so I do have to give him credit for that. I'll also give him credit for consolidating the target market share a little bit to make a fantasy relevant wide receiver. And yes, I'm talking about Allen Robinson. If you own Robinson, I'm not too scared of the Broncos matchup. Last week, Tyrell Williams completely balled out against them. So if you have Allen Robinson, you got to ride that wave. On the Denver side of the ball, Cortland Sutton, Emmanuel Sanders, they both had really solid performances in week 1, but unfortunately they are facing Chicago. The same Chicago essentially shut down Aaron Rodgers. Joe Flacco is no Aaron Rodgers. It's definitely a night and day difference than playing Oakland, so temper your expectations, and even if you have a better option, don't be afraid to play them over these guys that overperformed in your bench. One of the worst things you can do is be too reactionary. A player has a big performance on your bench, you put him in only for him to dud. You take him out and he has that big game again, and you repeat that cycle. You don't want that to be a routine. Chicago Bears held Devontae Adams to one of his worst performances. Devontae Adams was the best wide receiver last year. Can they overcome it? Certainly, but I definitely would not put money on it. The Sunday night game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Atlanta Falcons, and there should be a lot of points scored. It's a primetime game. Wentz looked to be warmed up during the second half. He's got more weapons than he's ever really had. Deshaun Jackson looked great. Alshon Jeffrey looked like Alshon Jeffrey, and we should hopefully see a little bit more of Miles Sanders. Alshon and Ridley, they're basically ranked back-to-back, 26 and 27. Julio, he is ranked wide receiver 1. That's right, the highest ranked wide receiver, and he should completely feast against this defense that just allowed Case Keenum to walk all over them for an entire half. Imagine what Matt Ryan can do coming off of a poor performance himself. He's going to be out for blood. And I know a lot of people want to start Deshaun Jackson, especially riding off of that hot game. It's not the worst idea in the world. It certainly could pay off. We have him ranked as wide receiver 30. And again, it's one of those situations where we're trying to balance upside and safety. But there is still one matchup left. This is the Monday night game. And unfortunately, it took a disappointing turn because Sam Darnold is not going to be playing in the game. Jamison Crowder, at this point, he's looking like the best receiver on the field, the highest targeted receiver on the field, but we don't have a large enough sample size to say that. And Sam Darnold will also be out for several weeks, which means the person that's going to take the biggest hit is Robbie Anderson. With that said, neither one of them we're very excited about in this matchup. We would not really consider starting them at all. Wide receiver 45, wide receiver 46. The Browns defense, it's no joke. Probably not going to be a super high scoring game. I would suspect most of the work to be done by the running backs. And it's also two teams that are a little bit disheveled right now. You have the Jets, who lost their starting quarterback, and you have the Cleveland Browns, who basically added a million pieces and are trying to make sure everything works properly. So Landry we still have as a back-end wide receiver 3, and Odell, he's ranked wide receiver 5. But guys, that's going to do it for the video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, please hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.